What would you do if someone, without asking you, decided to invite 1,000 people onto your land? Just picture that for a moment. You wake up one morning thinking it's just another normal day, and suddenly you hear that a massive crowd is on its way to camp on your property, eating your grass, walking all over your fields, and leaving behind a mess that you will have to deal with. That's not just rude, it's outrageous. And in this story, it wasn't just any random person who pulled such a stunt. It was the one person who always had to stick her nose where it didn't belong. You know the type? The HOA Karen, who believes she can control everyone else's life while ignoring the fact that she has no right to step foot on my land, let alone invite others onto it. She didn't just cross a line, she tried to erase it completely. Now let me set the scene for you. I own a ranch, wide open land, fenced off, with animals that aren't there for decoration, but for real work. I put in long hours keeping the place in order, maintaining the property, and making sure everything runs smoothly. To me, this land isn't just property on paper. It's my livelihood. It's where I work, where I build, and where I find peace. But to Karen, well, to her, my ranch must have looked like some kind of playground. A free park where she could roll out her grand ideas and look like the queen of hospitality. Except she wasn't inviting her own friends over to her yard. She was throwing a free for all on my land. And when I say free for all, I mean it. She wasn't talking about a family picnic or a handful of neighbors. She was bragging about organizing a huge camping trip with tents, bonfires, music, and a crowd that could easily fill up a stadium section. Just imagine finding out that 1,000 strangers are about to trample over your private land. Think of the trash. Think of the noise. Think of the damage to fences, grass, and everything else. Not to mention the safety issue. My ranch isn't a public campground, and I don't run it as one. Bringing in people who have no clue how to behave around livestock or private property is asking for disaster. And yet, here was Karen, smiling like she had pulled off the deal of the year, proudly spreading the word as if she was the one with the authority. The HOA wasn't even involved. She acted on her own, because in her mind, rules never applied to her. I'll admit, when I first heard about it, I thought it was a bad joke. Who in their right mind thinks it's acceptable to gather 1,000 people on someone else's ranch? But when I saw the posts online, the messages floating around, and even people asking directions, I knew this wasn't just talk. It was happening, and it was happening fast. The anger that rose up in me wasn't just because of Karen's nerve. It was the complete lack of respect. My land, my animals, my work, all of it was treated like it didn't matter. And that was the moment I decided that if Karen wanted a wild camping experience, I was going to give her one she would never forget. I should tell you a little about the land before we go further, because this isn't just any patch of grass behind a white picket fence. My ranch stretches wide, with open fields, strong fences, and areas that are meant for livestock, not people with tents and coolers. It's the kind of place where you hear the sound of bulls snorting early in the morning and the wind brushing through tall grass. It's private, it's personal, and every corner of it has a purpose. I don't own it just for looks. I work it every single day. When you build a life on land like this, you learn to protect it. You respect it. Because it's not just dirt and grass. It's the foundation of your living. That's what made Karen's stunt all the more insulting. She wasn't just trespassing. She was stepping over years of sweat, money, and effort. And she wasn't alone in this. The HOA had always been a thorn in my side, pushing little rules about how things should look, where fences should stand, even the type of mailboxes allowed. But my land was outside their authority, and that made them furious. They couldn't control me, so they often looked for ways to annoy me. Karen, especially, she had that attitude of being the self-appointed ruler of everyone else's lives. The type who smiled in your face, but whispered behind your back. She was always complaining that my ranch wasn't community-friendly, whatever that meant. I never signed up to be part of their playground. My land was mine, plain and simple. Now, for Karen, organizing that giant campout was her chance to shine. At least, that's what she thought. She spread word in the neighborhood that this would be the event of the year, a chance to enjoy open space and fresh country air. Of course, she forgot to mention that none of it belonged to her. It was all stolen under the excuse of community spirit. The worst part? People actually believed her. Families were getting ready with tents, trailers, firewood, and coolers. Thinking they had free access to my property. They thought it was some kind of festival ground waiting for them. When I found out, I went from shock to anger, and from anger to disbelief. My land isn't safe for outsiders, not because I don't want people near it, but because livestock and strangers don't mix. Bulls are not pets. They aren't meant to be admired up close by kids running around with marshmallows on sticks. They're powerful, unpredictable, and protective of their territory. I've spent years working around them, and even I stay cautious. One wrong move, and you could get trampled. And yet here was Karen, setting up a situation where 1,000 people would wander straight into that danger without a clue of what they were walking into. It didn't take long for me to realize that this wasn't just disrespect. It was a direct challenge. My ranch wasn't some empty park waiting for a picnic. It was a living, breathing place that demanded care and caution. If I let this happen, I'd be opening the door for chaos, destruction, and maybe even serious injuries. That was the moment I stopped thinking of this as a nuisance and started preparing myself for what I had to do next. The first sign that things were getting real was the sound of cars. At first, it was just a few engines in the distance, nothing unusual on the road nearby. But then, more and more started rolling in. By the time I stepped outside, I could see lines of vehicles coming closer, headlights bouncing off the dirt road, like a parade that no one had invited. People were already unloading gear, tents, folding chairs, coolers, even portable grills. It wasn't just a casual meetup. This was an invasion, and it was happening right on my land. Karen stood near the entrance, like she was the host of some grand festival, greeting people with that smug smile she always wore. She acted as if the place belonged to her, waving folks in like it was all planned and approved. I could hear laughter and loud music blasting from speakers as more campers set up. Some kids ran across the field chasing each other, completely unaware of the fact that they were running into areas where bulls usually grazed. I clenched my fists, not because of the noise, but because of the danger. These people didn't know what they were walking into. They thought it was a free party in wide open space. But I knew better. 1,000 strangers tramping across land meant for livestock was a disaster waiting to happen. Every step they took made me angrier, not only at them, but at Karen. She had brought this chaos here without a single thought for the consequences. I tried to picture what would happen if I did nothing. By nightfall, the grass would be shredded. Trash would be everywhere. Campfires could spark into something worse. And then, the livestock. What if one of my bulls decided to charge? Most people have no idea how strong and territorial bulls are. They're not gentle giants. They're massive, muscle-packed animals that won't hesitate to defend their ground. Even I, with years of experience, keep a cautious distance. And here were these people, laughing, waving, setting up as if they were safe in a park. Some neighbors noticed me standing there and waved like I was part of this gathering. A few even shouted thanks, saying things like, "What a generous thing you've done." I didn't even respond. I wasn't about to play along with Karen's game. Inside, my patience was gone. She had crossed a line that no one should ever cross. This wasn't a small disagreement over HOA rules anymore. This was trespassing, plain and simple, and not just by one person. It was a full-blown invasion backed by Karen's lies. As the crowd kept pouring in, my decision grew clearer with every passing minute. I could call the cops, sure, but by the time they showed up, the damage would already be done. I could try yelling, but who was going to listen over the sound of music and chatter? No, I needed something that would send a message, something instant, something that would remind everyone that this was not their playground. And I knew exactly what that was. I walked back toward the barn with one thought running through my head. If Karen wanted to treat my land like a circus, then I was about to show her what a real show looked like. The bulls had been restless that day, stomping around in the pen, snorting like they already sensed something was off. These weren't docile pets you could pat on the head. They were heavy, aggressive, and territorial, bred to protect and dominate their space. Anyone who truly knew ranch life would have kept a mile away from them. But these campers had no clue what kind of power they were stepping into. They thought the biggest risk was running out of marshmallows or their tent blowing away in the wind. They were about to learn different. As I leaned on the fence, watching the bulls pace back and forth, I thought about my options again. I could try to reason with Karen, but what good had that ever done? She never listened, never admitted fault, and never cared about anything that didn't serve her ego. I could make phone calls, but by the time anyone responded, the crowd would have torn my land apart. No, this time, words wouldn't fix it. This time, it had to be action, something that would burn itself into their memories so deeply they'd never try it again. And honestly, watching Karen's smug smile vanish was something I looked forward to more than I wanted to admit. I opened the gate slowly, careful not to spook the bulls too early. Their ears twitched as they caught the noise from the campers down the field. Music, shouting, laughter. To them, it wasn't a party. It was intrusion. They could feel it. They lowered their heads, hooves digging into the dirt as if ready for a challenge. I let them linger there for a moment, just enough to build up their tension. I wasn't unleashing them blindly. I knew how they moved, how they reacted. This was about letting them do what came naturally, while teaching a lesson to every unwanted guest trampling over what wasn't theirs. Meanwhile, the campers had no idea what was coming. Some were setting up giant tents like they were preparing for a festival weekend. Kids ran too close to the fences, tossing rocks and daring each other to climb. Adults cracked open drinks, raising toasts to community fun. Karen strutted around like she was the star of the evening, arms folded, chin high, as if this whole gathering had been her generous gift to the neighborhood. I almost laughed, knowing her spotlight was about to turn into a nightmare. I stepped back, gave the bulls room, and with one firm motion, I pulled the latch wide open. The heavy gates swung, and the animals surged forward with force, muscles rippling, hooves pounding the ground like thunder. Dust rose as they charged, their deep bellows cutting through the music. The first scream cut through the air like a warning siren, and then everything broke loose. People who had been lounging in lawn chairs dropped their drinks and scrambled to their feet. Music that had been blasting only seconds before was drowned out by the thunder of hooves and the panicked shouts of a crowd that suddenly realized they weren't at a festival. They were in a danger zone. Tents collapsed as families tried to grab their belongings in a frenzy. But most didn't even bother. They bolted, leaving coolers, bags, and half-built shelters behind. The bulls stormed across the open field with raw power, their heads low, nostrils flaring, eyes locked on the movement of hundreds of terrified strangers. Dust clouds kicked up around them, making the scene even more chaotic. Campers tripped over each other, shoes flying off, children screaming as parents scooped them up and ran. What had been laughter and chatter only moments earlier turned into a chorus of fear and desperation. The crowd scattered in every direction, desperate to escape the unstoppable force charging behind them. Karen's smug grin disappeared faster than anyone else's. She went from acting like the queen of the event to screaming orders no one listened to. She shouted at people to stay calm, but her voice cracked as one of the bulls veered close, sending her diving behind a cooler for cover. Her perfect posture, her confidence, her arrogance, it all collapsed in an instant. Watching her crawl through the dirt, trying to avoid the animals she had practically invited into this mess, was a moment I'll never forget. The more people screamed and ran, the more the bulls chased. They weren't attacking for sport. They were doing what bulls do, protecting their territory, asserting dominance, making it clear that this land wasn't up for grabs. A few brave campers tried waving their arms or shouting to distract them, but that only drew the bulls' focus closer. Panic spread like wildfire, and within minutes, the once crowded campsite looked like a battlefield. Coolers were overturned, blankets scattered, and tents ripped apart as people abandoned everything in their rush to escape. Some tried jumping fences, only to find themselves stuck or tumbling into thorny bushes. Others sprinted toward their cars, fumbling with keys, slamming doors shut just as the bulls barreled past. Engines roared as vehicles backed up in every direction, horns blaring as drivers tried to squeeze out of the narrow dirt road all at once. The traffic jam only made it worse, with people screaming at each other while still glancing nervously over their shoulders at the massive animals stamping their ground. From where I stood, it was absolute chaos, but it was also justice. For once, Karen wasn't in control. For once, the people who treated my land like a free campground understood the reality. This wasn't theirs to take. It wasn't a playground, it wasn't a festival, and it definitely wasn't safe. Every last one of them ran with fear in their eyes, chased not just by bulls, but by the truth that they had no business being there in the first place. When the last of the cars screeched down the road and the shouts faded into the distance, all that remained was silence, broken only by the heavy breathing of the bulls and the distant rattling of broken tents left behind. The wide open field that had been crawling with people minutes earlier now looked like the remains of a storm. Coolers lay tipped over, with ice melting into the dirt. Blankets were tangled in the grass, and half-eaten food was scattered across the ground. It was almost hard to believe that such a huge crowd had vanished so quickly. But fear has a way of clearing out a place faster than anything else. The bulls slowed down, stamping the earth one last time before retreating toward the far side of the pasture. Satisfied that the invaders had been driven away, I stood there watching the mess, and I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, there was satisfaction. Karen's grand plan had collapsed right in front of her, and she had been forced to run just like everyone else. On the other hand, there was the reality of what had been left behind. Trash was everywhere. Beer bottles glistened in the sunlight. Bags of chips had burst open under the rush of panicked feet. It looked less like a campsite and more like the aftermath of a failed carnival. The land I worked so hard to keep clean and functional had been treated like a dumping ground in less than an hour. I started walking through the wreckage, kicking aside plastic cups and stepping around piles of gear that people had abandoned in their rush to escape. There were lawn chairs tipped over, speakers still buzzing faintly with static, even a few phones that must have slipped out of pockets in the chaos. The deeper I went, the more I realized how careless the whole thing had been. These weren't respectful campers who left behind neat ashes from a fire. These were people who never should have been here at all, who felt entitled to take without permission and leave without a second thought. What struck me the most, though, was the quiet. 1,000 people had filled the air with noise, and now it was just the rustling grass and the snorts of bulls in the distance. That silence felt heavier than the chaos itself. It was a reminder that this land was mine, and it was meant to stay that way. No matter how hard Karen or anyone else tried to claim it, the truth had been proven in the most undeniable way possible. And somewhere out there, Karen was probably still catching her breath, furious that her big show had turned into a nightmare. She had wanted to embarrass me, to use my land as her stage. Instead, she had been the one humiliated, crawling in the dirt and fleeing alongside everyone else. The thought of her trying to explain what happened to the very neighbors she had invited made me almost laugh. Her pride had been trampled harder than any tent in that field. It didn't take long before the phone calls started. The HOA office was buzzing the very next morning, and my name was on everyone's lips. Neighbors who had been part of Karen's grand camping stunt were furious, not at her, but at me. They wanted to know why I had endangered them, why I had let bulls loose while families and kids were on the property. The part they refused to admit was that none of them had permission to be there in the first place. They acted like they were the victims, while I was the one standing in the middle of a trashed pasture, cleaning up their garbage. Karen, of course, was at the front of it all. She strutted into the HOA meeting like a soldier returning from battle, her voice loud, her finger pointed squarely at me. She claimed I had put lives at risk, that I had acted recklessly, that my behavior was unneighborly and dangerous. But behind her shaky confidence, I could see it in her eyes. Fear and embarrassment still clung to her. She had been the one crawling through the dirt. She had been the one screaming louder than anyone else when the bulls came charging. And now she was desperate to flip the story, to cover her humiliation with blame. I sat quietly through most of it, letting her rant and rave, letting the neighbors nod along, until the time came when I had enough. I reminded them, one by one, that they had trespassed, that not a single person who set foot on my ranch had permission. I explained that my land is private, fenced, and clearly marked, and that entering it without my approval was not only disrespectful, but also illegal. I pointed out that the bulls had been in their pasture, their rightful place, and that it was Karen who had led a crowd of people straight into danger without a second thought. The room grew quieter as I laid it all out. Faces that had been so eager to glare at me suddenly turned toward her. And the more I spoke, the more her excuses fell apart. She tried to interrupt, but I wouldn't let her twist the facts. I had proof. Pictures of the mess left behind, videos of cars clogging the road, and witnesses who saw her leading the whole event. She had no defense except anger. By the end of the meeting, the tide had shifted. Neighbors who had once cheered her on were now whispering about fines, lawsuits, and liability. The HOA, realizing they couldn't pin this on me, began to question whether Karen had overstepped. She left the room red-faced, muttering under her breath, her pride crushed even further than before. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like the upper hand was mine, not just on my land, but in the community that had tried so hard to push me down. In the days that followed, the story of Karen's disaster spread far beyond the neighborhood. Word traveled fast, and soon, even people who had nothing to do with the HOA knew about the so-called campout gone wrong. I didn't have to tell the tale. Everyone else did it for me. Parents whispered about how close their kids had come to being trampled. Teenagers laughed about how fast Karen had run when the bulls came storming. And neighbors who once believed every word she said now rolled their eyes whenever her name came up. The queen of control had become the clown of the community, and she had no one to blame but herself. The HOA tried to smooth things over at first, sending polite letters about future cooperation and avoiding misunderstandings, but I knew what that really meant. They were terrified of being held accountable for what Karen had done. I had photos of the trash, the broken fences, the tire ruts carved deep into the dirt. I had videos of crowds pouring in, cheering as they set up camp on property that wasn't theirs. All of it was evidence that could have turned into lawsuits, fines, and a public mess the HOA couldn't afford. So instead of blaming me, they quietly began distancing themselves from Karen. Meetings were suddenly scheduled without her. Her voice, once loud and commanding, was cut off mid-sentence. The same people who had clapped for her plans now avoided eye contact when she walked into the room. As for me, I got the peace I had been demanding all along. No more cars parked along my fences. No more HOA members nosing around my property like they owned it. Everyone understood clearly now that the ranch was mine, and that trespassing wasn't just a bad idea, it was dangerous. The bulls had made sure of that lesson. Strangely enough, I didn't even have to threaten legal action. The chaos had spoken louder than any lawyer ever could. Karen herself became quieter too. The woman who used to knock on doors and spread gossip now kept to herself, avoiding eye contact at the grocery store, rushing past people at community events. She had built her reputation on being in charge, and once that was stripped away, there was nothing left for her to stand on. The humiliation of being chased across a field by my bulls was something she could never scrub from people's memories. And me? I went back to my ranch, to the silence and the work I had always valued. The land healed quickly once the garbage was cleared and the fences repaired. The bulls settled back into their routine, calm and steady, as if nothing had happened at all. But I knew the message had sunk deep. My land wasn't a playground. It wasn't free real estate for power-hungry neighbors to use as a stage. It was mine, and no one would ever forget that again. Sometimes, the only way to teach respect is to let nature do the talking. And on that day, the bulls spoke louder than any words I could have ever said.